Hey, Volk. Good evening. When I started this podcast and in the process of writing it, one of the things that I wanted to do was to create a podcast at a certain production value where the media, both audio and video, were the most accessible and that they could be made to the best of my ability. Um, right now, this isn't the case. I'm using my ancient MacBook camera. And because I'm at home, you might hear roosters, maybe the neighbor's donkey in the background, okay? But that's just the reality and something to consider if you're ever thinking of leaving the US to become a creator in Mexico, right? So I think we're all waiting on the details of the Biden legalization or the comprehensive immigration reform bill. And I have some concerns. I'm a little nervous. I've been trying to find the way to express my feelings and my thoughts about it in a way that's constructive and in a way that isn't going to, I would say, discourage folk from organizing or discourage folk from pushing for some sort of legislation. I think we're overdue on that front, right? But in hearing what's been proposed and seeing the sort of typical actors, right? The Chirlas, the United We Dreams, some of the other traditional and I think more institutionally well-known immigration rights actors and their positions and priorities, I'm starting to have questions and I'm starting to see a trend, right? For folk who are younger and who have maybe only very blurry memories of what immigrant rights looked like in the past, and I'm talking immediately during the Bush years, right? The Sensenbrenner bill in 2006, the mega marches, and then the Harry Reid bill in 2007. Essentially, it proposed a devil's bargain. We would support, and I'm saying Democrats and the immigrant rights mainstream, right, including some labor allies, we would support massive funding for Border Patrol. We would support massive funding for surveillance, for technology at the border in exchange for legalization. It's really a testament to where the movement is that the Biden administration, at least from what we've been drip fed by other organizations, isn't considering enforcement and detention and deportation as a necessary compromise for legalization. That's long overdue. One of my biggest regrets in my organizing and in my time on this issue was the initial support for the Gang of Eight bill. If we look at that bill, right, without going into the specific numbers, essentially it would have been the largest increase in border funding, border militarization and detention funding, essentially since the creation of ICE. And we were supposed to accept that in exchange for a 10-year path to citizenship for an indeterminate number of people. And this is important. I've tweeted this a few times. I've mentioned it in casual conversation. But I think I want to urge folk to start seeing long processes for legalization as a form of deportation through attrition. You only have to look at DACA, right, for a similar phenomenon. If you look at the hundreds of thousands of eligible DACA applicants, you compare that to the actual number of DACA applicants, and then you start tracing renewals over time, you start seeing a trend, right? One, that not everyone who qualified got that relief. And there are very important reasons as to why. The number one being knowledge, access, and then the fee. And the second thing that you see emerge from people falling out of DACA, both for the inability to afford the renewal and because of criminalization that made them ineligible for DACA or to renew for DACA, right? And that is the way in which these programs may help people in the short term. You may see that people qualify in the short term, but they'll drop out. DACA was at one point, right, a 2-year renewal process. People dropped out and were unable to renew within those 2 years. Every sort of rumor or, soft confirmation from people like Lorella Praeli tells us that this process will be 8 years for most immigrant folk, that it might be sped up for DACA and TPS holders. But my question is, why make that distinction? If we could see through DACA that our communities are still being criminalized, that economic issues remain a fundamental barrier for legalization, even semi-regularization like DACA, why would we accept an 8-year process? What does that mean? What will that mean for people who start a process and then have to be on their best behavior or just hope, right, that police or life doesn't intervene? In many cases, it will. In shelters, rehabilitation centers, in call centers, throughout Guadalajara, in my experience, there are many folk who started processes. There are folk who had green card petitions through their families or their spouses, who one day found themselves caught up in an ICE raid, and despite being permanent residents, were deported for various reasons. These are people who already qualified for a certain form of relief that already exists. Are we going to add additional hurdles, additional barriers for new people? Again, the longer the process, the more expensive it is, the less people you'll actually reach. The Biden administration and its allies are talking about a legalization for 11 million people. 11 million people will not be legalized if there are high barriers to entry. That's something to consider going forward. That's very important. And there's no reason, no good reason, to distinguish between DACA and TPS holders and other undocumented folk who've been in the country for decades. We, as a youth, and now as a young adult movement, or in my case, right, as a dinosaur in my 30s, we've had constant conversations about the way in which the movement throws our parents and our communities under the bus. This is one of those ways. And we can't mince our words and disguise it as a victory when we know that an 8-year process for most people is a guarantee that people will not be able to complete that process. And again, the caveat here, right, is that we haven't actually seen legislation yet. There's talk of a deportation moratorium through executive order. What's the legal strategy when inevitably opponents sue, I don't know, in Texas to get it stopped? You know, we fought so hard for extended DACA and DAPA, and to see it die in the courts, I think should have been a lesson. We can't repeat those mistakes. The stakes are too high. There's many pieces of immigration reform that will be complicated, and no bill will be perfect and all-encompassing, and I think that's important to say off the bat. As a leadership in the United States, immigrant rights organizations need to be explicit about who they're excluding. And the most obvious and the most glaring example for me is any sort of cutoff date that limits benefits to people who arrive only before a certain date. If we are willing to accept creating another generation of undocumented and irregular migrants in exchange for legalization, not for 11 million, but for a subset of the 11 million who initially qualified, is that a win? Are we trading lives here of people who are already in the country for those who will inevitably arrive? The era of mass migration isn't over. We are entering a second phase of it. I look at the world and the reasons why people are fleeing, right? A combination of economic and social factors made worse by climate change, by crop failures, by water scarcity, and conflicts over resources are going to create new waves of refugees and migrants. In the same way that our parents and ourselves, in many cases, were excluded by previous amnesties, and the same way immigration bills that were supposed to assist a subset of our community also came with punishments, with exclusions, that are the reason many of you and, folk in the future will be and are undocumented. It's not acceptable for me. And I know people are hungry for a win. I know people, I think in many cases, are willing to accept what we can get. I understand that. And that is why I supported the Gang of Eight bill at one point, and why I was in Buck McKeon's office trying to convince him to vote or help move it in the House. I don't regret anything as much as I do that work. I don't regret anything that I've done in my organizing as much as I do the supporting the Gang of Eight bill initially. When it dawned on me what that bill would do to our community, I felt flat-footed. Like I had just been caught in a massive scandal that we just sort of looked the other way on. I'm not willing to do that. Not this time, We need to have a conversation, and a very detailed conversation, about what policy goals and policy wins look like. Legalization on its own isn't a solution for the problems we're having. We cannot be content with asking for a modified Gang of Eight bill. We can't be content for asking for the same bullshit we asked for in the Reid-Bush Jr. bill. That is a betrayal of our community's trust. It's a betrayal of our movement's imagination and its potential. Are we willing to demand an end to the bars, the way legislation in the Senate already has? Are we willing to make that retroactive for people who've been deported? Are we willing to demand that resources for our community be provided? Are we willing to demand that, hey, maybe for the first time in its history, USCIS should get funding so that application fees aren't the only way to fund the application process? There are things like that. There are minutiae and details and ideas that will inevitably come through the process. But who is at the table and who is going to suggest that? Where are the leadership in this specific scenario? Where are the leaders? And what are they actually telling legislators? What are they actually telling the incoming administration? I am in general a strident person, and I get moved emotionally very easily by stories and things that I see in real life, and also, through you, and memories that I have of the people I organized with, the people who attended our DACA clinics with their parents and, managed to get an application together and could never send it because $500 for them might as well have been 5 million. There was just no way to raise it. And here, sitting in a cafe in Guadalajara in a Tony neighborhood and seeing migrants from Cameroon, seeing migrants from Central America, attempting to get to the United States for reasons of safety, to escape the gnawing anxiety of not knowing whether you'll have a meal tomorrow or whether you'll be safe tomorrow. Hearing them, seeing them presents a tremendous moral challenge, I think, for us as a movement. We can't trade tomorrow's immigrants, tomorrow's refugees, for those of the past. That is sort of the original sin of immigrant rights in a lot of ways. And I remember when I briefly worked at a call center, right? The faces and the people I worked with and the way they live in a sort of in-between limbo, where the desire to return to their life in the United States collides with a memory of what it was like to live there as an undocumented person. And everyone's story will be different. Everyone's journey will go where it needs to go. But without agency, without the ability to make that decision and have it actually be a decision, many more people, many more generations are going to get stuck in that same emotional turmoil of migration, return migration, and everything that happens in between, right? The trauma of detention, the trauma of criminalization that we talk about ad nauseum, but have yet to really address at its roots. I want our immigrant rights leaders in the United States to begin talking about drug offenses. I want our immigrant rights leaders in the United States to start talking about the complex lives that immigrants lead. I want us to realize that the struggle to end mass incarceration, the struggle to end the impacts of the drug war on Black and Latino communities, that is also a migrant rights issue. And I want us to finally stop talking about it in hushed tones, in a sense that we're ashamed. I think there's been enough of that. We need to have a conversation. We need to advance the conversation that's already existing. I think that's a better idea, right? We've had this conversation for so long. We keep talking about our communities being criminalized. But I urge folk, I strongly urge folk to ask for more. I don't want to have this conversation in 20 years. I don't want to have this conversation in 5 years. Fuck. Reading the tweets, reading the articles, seeing the visible tension and frustration amongst my friends who are still in immigrant rights, I ask myself, how is it possible we haven't advanced past 2001? Are we still in the Clinton years in terms of our dialogue and our demands? We need a new migration narrative. We need to connect the migrant rights movement to our conversations about climate change, about mass incarceration, about how these ideas of colonialism and imperialism that we've worked really hard to educate ourselves on and disseminate in in our communities, to raise our conscience as a collective unit, that there are moments where opportunities arise, that there are moments where we need to act. We can't dialogue anymore. And one of those places, I think, is this opportunity to influence legislation on immigration. And I'm torn because I had made a decision that I never wanted to return to the United States. When I got on that airplane at LAX, I knew that I would never likely see California again. But that was my choice. I was able to, for the first time in my life, make that decision. For a lot of folk who will be excluded by this bill, from what I can tell already based on the very scant information we have, the people who will qualify but will be unable to complete the process, the people who will be in limbo qualifying yet in deportation proceedings because American bureaucracy and the law work slowly. My heart breaks, right? In a lot of ways, it hurts because I've had the opportunity now to see it from both sides of the border in a very real way and experience that and that narrative in two very distinct voices. People here will talk about the fact that deported folk are forgotten. I think a better way of articulating that feeling is to say that even before someone is deported, they've already been forgotten. They've already been excluded. And it's hard to tell someone who has the hope that their life will change, right? That it'll depend on whether they can afford thousands of dollars in lawyer fees and whether they can stay out of trouble for 8 years. I think that's a calamity. I think for people who are just trying to survive, right? I think about the images of the caravan in Honduras and the gas and the police violence. And, there are children in these crowds who are the same age when I crossed the border, right? And I remember the way in which my crossing experience marked my life forever, right? The way it's really seared into my memory and the way that it's, in a lot of ways, inescapable for me, right? I will always be that 4-year-old. I think about the fact that if everything doesn't line up, that if the changes to the asylum and refugee process don't happen soon enough, right? Or at all, that we are creating another generation of undocumented and illegal folk. And all of the infrastructure, the knowledge, the leadership that the movement has built up over, 26 years? 25 years since IRIRA. That all of that will be gone in the sense that people will want to move on. People will want to believe that the issue is taken care of. And we're leaving people now at the mercy of states, counties, and cities that are still going to criminalize, arrest, and kill folk. At the mercy of prison systems that the pandemic has really exposed as being part of a very dangerous, downright murderous apparatus. For me here in Guadalajara, right, and I'm just one person and I am speaking from my very particular experience in migrant rights. It's not everyone's experience, I understand that. But for me, right now, in this moment, I couldn't really wait. I couldn't really hold my tongue anymore. We need folk to be brave. And brave here doesn't necessarily mean, to return to the direct actions of the past right away or to escalate tactics. Brave means, in this specific moment where we still are, it means allowing our imaginations their full breadth, their full power. It means not going to the negotiating table, already conceding what we haven't even asked for yet. It took a very long time. It took millions of people who were deported and apprehended at the border to get us to the place where the Biden administration is now willing to push for legalization without further border funding. I would be shocked. And honestly, I would be appalled if, as advocates in a movement, we're not willing to ask for that extra step. We're not willing to ask for those policy changes that we've discussed in hotel lobbies, at conferences, and bars, right? Hungover the next morning after the club at 6 a.m., where we have these ideas, these changes that we've identified that we haven't brought to the table yet because we concede too early that they're not realistic, that they're not going to happen. This is the moment to make them happen. We're at an inflection point. And if we don't stand firmly in the ground of where we are as a world, as to what's happening, as to what displacement actually looks like, I'm afraid we're going to be here again. But I'm not going to be in my 20s or my 30s. I'm going to be in my 50s or my 60s. And you who are listening to this will have an entirely new life, an entirely new world of concerns and priorities. And we'll lose that historic memory, that institutional knowledge to be able to affect change. Our best bet is to prepare for that future of mass migration. As people who've experienced it already, to pry open the door and ensure that we're ready to receive those who are going to be like us in the way that those who were like us were never able to do for us. And I'll be here in Guadalajara, and I will be following the conversation closely. I will do what I can, right? As a self-deported person, as someone who sees a lot of hope, even in this moment of anger, this moment of fear. And I hope I'm not alone in that. I hope that the leadership is willing to put values, it's willing to put hope and a real sense of justice before organization politics, before party politics. I hope that this doesn't break apart our organizations and our friendships the way other immigration proposals have. Because, maybe I'm a conspiracy nut, but it always seems to be that these immigration proposals, even when they die in cloture, they succeed in breaking apart our movement and splintering it along lines of personality and political ideology. If that seems to be an inevitability and has been historically true, let's hope that it happens for the right reasons. Let's hope it happens because we're demanding the most we can get. And not because we're settling for the bare minimum. Because 8 years of waiting to become a citizen after 25, 30 years of already being undocumented is the bare minimum. And I'll say it until my voice is hoarse. Any sort of legalization that has that kind of timetable, that has what I'm assuming will be high costs, is deportation through attrition. And I'll reiterate what I said earlier. If the immigrant rights leadership, if the leadership in Congress and in the new administration is willing to live with excluding folk, let's be explicit about that so that we know who we're fighting against and we know what we need to improve on and who our allies and who our leaders are. Because a bill to legalize 11 million that only legalizes 6, maybe 7 million, does what? Functionally, what does it do? It only creates a more concentrated form of misery for those who will not be able to take advantage of those laws and those programs. And again, thinking about folk here in Mexico who've been deported already, thinking about the migrants who will make their way through Mexico in the future, thinking about the friends from around the world that I had in California that, I miss and I accepted that I might never see again. I really hope that as a movement, we're ready to be brave and we're ready to demand more. It's shocking that so many people who are called dreamers are so afraid to use their imaginations for better worlds, for not what immigration is, but what it could be, not what the law might permit, but what it should. We're at that moment. And yeah. We'll see tomorrow, I guess, huh? But for now, don't sell yourself short. We have to imagine bigger things are possible. We have to imagine that any action on immigration will not just be for 11 million people, but for 6 or 7 billion. Because those are the stakes. And what we deserve are humane, justice-centered alternatives to the, 3/4 centuries, a century, I guess, since the Rosero program of mass deportation.